Today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Aley Shazly to this week's CEO Chats. Dr. Shazly is currently a professor, the Department Chair of Geology at Marshall University. He received his undergraduate degree in geology from the University of Alexandria in Egypt. He then received a master's in geology at Stanford University, followed by receiving his PhD in geology a few years later while at Stanford. Dr. Shazly, welcome to Deep Power.
All right, thank you. Thanks for this introduction.
You bet. So from reading your background, it would be safe to say that you like rocks, correct?
That's right. Yes. Right. I'm a metamorphic petrologist by training. And so what that means is, I study those rocks that have formed by changes in the environment, especially in temperature and pressure. And my main objective is to try and understand how these rocks form, in which tectonic setting, how they can help us understand the history of the area in which they are exposed.
Very interesting. So, I got to ask, I love digging into the dirt as a kid and finding cool rocks. In fact, when I was in college, my freshman year, I took a geology class. And I thought it was fascinating, but I always questioned as a 19-year-old, how could you ever make money or have a living studying rocks? And really little did I know 20 years later, I'd be the CEO of a geothermal drilling technology company trying to drill through super hard rock to reach, geothermal energy. So I'm curious, with that background, how did you become so interested in geology? And how did that take you to be getting your PhD at Stanford?
Right. So, as a kid, I was kind of interested, as most kids are, in kind of dinosaurs, that kind of stuff, fossils. However, it only took me, I guess, my first lecture in college in the paleontology, in one of the many paleontology classes that we had to take, to decide that I definitely did not like fossils. I definitely did not like paleontology. And luckily, at that time, I had already developed an interest in mineralogy, in organic chemistry, that side of things. So very quickly, I got hooked onto rocks. I was interested in getting a master's and a PhD. And so I applied to a number of universities. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship from then ITT company to study towards a master's at Stanford. So I consider that a lot of good fortune. And as I started working at Stanford towards my master's, I was approached by my advisors. Well, why don't you turn that into a PhD? And so I said, yeah, well, absolutely, that's my ultimate goal. So I ended up staying on beyond the 2-year scholarship. I had the fortune to be supported by the Department of Geology at Stanford, and then later, towards the end of my tenure at Stanford, by the National Science Foundation, by one of the grants. Throughout my career at Stanford, I was studying rocks known as blue schists and eclogites that occur in Oman. So at the time, there was very little that was known about these rocks. So my objective was to try and find out how they formed, at what pressures and temperatures, how do they relate to the famous suite known as, the ophiolitic suite in Oman, that were very, very well studied at the time. And then, at what time did they form? What was, where is all of this, what does all of this imply in terms of the tectonic setting and the tectonic history? So, at the time, this was, I thought that my thesis overall made some contribution towards a better understanding of the tectonic history of the continental margin of Oman, of the Arabian Peninsula, basically. So.
Very interesting. I guess you could almost say that was a metamorphic transformation or a path for you to go where you are now. And I think it's
Right.
interesting that there are still new areas that haven't been studied, or like you said, when you started, you were trying to blaze a trail on studying that sector that hadn't. So thank you for that background. I think it's always interesting to hear how people get where they are, and how that passion kind of leads them there. And hard rock, that's kind of a common theme here in the geothermal energy. Hard rock is hard to drill through. And as I said, Deep Power is a geothermal drilling technology company, and anyone trying to really reach super hot rock, which is about 400 degrees Celsius, has to face miles of super hard rock to drill through. So that's one of the greatest challenges or hurdles in accessing that super hot rock, is drilling through super hard rock. So clearly different areas of the earth have different compositions of rock, rock types that may make it easier or harder. And I'm just curious, with your study of geology in general, how can the better understanding of rocks, rock formations, rock types, like their hardness, make the task of drilling through them more realistic?
Well, I mean, it's the three rock types are obviously sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic, and drilling through sedimentary rocks is a little bit easier. They have a significant amount of porosity, um, maybe fractures, that kind of stuff. So it's easier to kind of disaggregate them as you're drilling down. Once you get into the igneous and metamorphic rocks, all of these are crystalline rocks. There is no pore space per se. It becomes you're just basically drilling through the entire the minerals, and it's difficult to disaggregate those rocks. So I wouldn't use the word super hard or even super hot, because I think I've noticed that you've drilled down to 9.6 kilometers essentially, or 9.6 miles, I think. Is that correct? Or I can't remember the maximum depth that your company has actually reached. That's more like the kind of temperatures that you want to get to, indicating you're at 400 degrees Celsius. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that where you want to be?
Yep, that's the goal. At 400 degrees Celsius, there's supercritical steam, which it's neither
Right.
an air or a liquid. So that's the goal. And what they say is, studies show that at supercritical steam has 10 times more the energy potential than a liquid or a gas.
Right. Absolutely. The idea is that as you drill deeper in an area, I mean, in general, we go by what is known as the geothermal gradient, and I'm sure you're aware of that. So the geothermal gradient, an average geothermal gradient, is somewhere around 25 to 30 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So to get to at the depths that you're talking about, and to get to the temperature that you're hoping to reach, around 400 Celsius or so, definitely, yes, you are dealing with a supercritical fluid. So you're really looking at not an extremely high geothermal gradient. It is a higher than normal geothermal gradient. It's probably more like you're looking at 40, perhaps 40 degrees Celsius per kilometer, as opposed to 25 to 30. So that is kind of, I think, doable, in areas with some magmatic activity at great depth, and so it doesn't have to be on top of a hotspot, particularly, or a major hotspot, or like Yellowstone or things like that, where you would have higher geothermal gradients, but it still is driven by presence of the magma at some depth. So again, I wouldn't go for the term super hot, because super hot to me means, I might be on top of a mid-oceanic ridge, for instance, where the temperature is so high, or in an area where really there is a major mantle plume and a major hotspot. like the ones that I'm sure you're familiar with, perhaps, in New Zealand or in Italy or Yellowstone and things like that. So.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think, and you bring up a good point. The super hot and super hard rocks are more terms or phraseology in the geothermal energy or industry that people have used. So I'm speaking to an expert here with a PhD in geology. So I understand how you might not use that same language, but that's a common kind of way to describe it. Maybe it's not as accurate as it should be, but you mentioned some of the Earth's tectonics and the different areas of the Earth. One of the things that are interesting is the oil and gas industry has never really needed to drill far enough to face the challenges that we found. The oil reserves are in different pockets. They don't have to drill that deep. So this is really a new pioneered industry where there's several challenges of the hardness of the rock that has to be drilled through, the heat, as you mentioned, the temperature, and that technology doesn't exist to be able to withstand the heat and or the corrosiveness of the gases at that depth. And so there's a lot of work to be done. For example, one of the things one of our platform pieces we're working on is not only the drilling aspect, but once you've drilled that deep, being able to protect your piping, your casing with coatings that can withstand that heat and that the corrosivity. So that's something that we're also working on with some other sponsored research projects, in addition to our research project at the University of Oklahoma. But I'm just curious, with your background, there's new technology to survey different parts of the Earth, and where might be more shallow, and you could access those temperatures. But with your understanding of the Earth's tectonics and the different formations across the globe, I'm just curious, do you have any insight or any I guess any advice in terms of trying to explore, and where would you start to be able to tap? Obviously, you'd go closer to the volcanoes or the magmatic activity, but what insights do you have on that?
Right. I mean, this is kind of a little bit difficult, and I'm not sure I really have the answer to that. But we have maybe about 45 or so different hotspots on Earth. Their locations are fairly well known. So I think that should be your starting point. Now, not all of them are extremely, active or famous, such as, the Hawaiian hotspot or Yellowstone, or New Zealand, Wairaki, or in southern Italy. But there are others, and I would say those are probably the ones you want to go for. The idea is you're going to be also pumping your own fluid down there and bringing it back, as you mentioned, in the form of a supercritical fluid. So one of the things, perhaps, and I'm talking just off the top of my head, I don't know whether this really makes much sense or not, but I would say, you're in control in terms of the corrosiveness. So try thinking about adding certain chemicals to your fluid, to your water, essentially, that you're pumping down the drill hole, so that, by the time it gets superheated, it's not as corrosive. Now, even pure water, when it becomes a supercritical fluid, it's definitely going to become on the corrosive side. We know that. The pH is actually going to go down. The acidity, is going to increase, even if it's a pure water. So I think you're in control. You kind of add certain chemicals there, perhaps, and hope that it would be less corrosive. I think that's the best to hope for on your equipment, on your drilling equipment. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it is definitely a science to be able to control those aspects, and it's a big challenge, and there are a lot of obstacles to overcome. There's a lot of misunderstanding in the geothermal industry in terms of what is required to really be able to generate the power that's needed. And I've used this example in the past, but And when I mention geothermal to other people, they comment, oh, my uncle heats their pool with geothermal, and that's good, and that's a very important factor. But to really produce the power capacity needed, we really have to drill to the depths that can create that heat to generate that steam. So it's a big challenge, but for us, being able to have energy independence from tyrants or governments or people or corporations is so important that it's a worthwhile effort. And there's a lot of, like I said, education that has to happen to the government and to lawmakers to help them understand. But I think it's important. And, your background in geology for our audience is important because we're drilling through these materials that have different components and makeup. And so I appreciate your background, your expertise. One of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you today is we may have to come to you in the future and ask for your guidance and advice on different areas that we're trying to drill in the rock composition, right, and get your feedback. But I wanted our audience and people that watch this to understand that, this is geology we're talking about. We're creating new technology, but we're drilling through rock. And your understanding of rock can be helpful in that endeavor. So I appreciate your time. I look forward to staying in touch with you. And I hope you have a great weekend, and go Marshall.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.